In the dusty garage behind Turner Auto Repair in Blue Ridge, Texas, 17-year-old Grace Turner worked tirelessly on what everyone called junkyard dreams. A custom Mustang, built from salvaged parts that drew nothing but mockery from her classmates. 3 years after a devastating car accident left her wheelchair-bound, Grace poured her brilliant automotive mind into creating something extraordinary, while popular girl Brittany Wells and her wealthy boyfriend Derek Shaw led daily campaigns of humiliation at Blue Ridge High School. But when Grace's older brother Luke entered her homemade race car in the annual Blue Ridge Championship, nobody expected the girl they'd dismissed as broken to engineer a machine that would leave professional drivers speechless and transform a town's understanding of what true strength really means. Quick pause before we continue. Tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing. The morning sun filtered through the grimy windows of Turner Auto Repair, casting long shadows across the concrete floor where Grace Turner maneuvered her wheelchair between scattered car parts and half-assembled engines. Her calloused hands, stained with motor oil and determination, gripped a wrench as she fine-tuned the carburetor of what most people in Blue Ridge called her impossible project. The 1967 Mustang fastback sitting before her looked nothing like the sleek machines that graced magazine covers, but Grace saw potential where others saw scrap metal. "Morning, sweetheart," Ray Turner called from beneath the hood of a customer's pickup truck, his voice carrying the weathered tone of a man who'd spent 30 years coaxing life from broken engines. "You're up early again." Grace wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving another streak of grease across her already dirty face. "Couldn't sleep," she replied, not looking up from her work. "I think I figured out why the timing's been off." Ray emerged from under the hood, his own hands just as stained as his daughter's, and walked over to inspect her progress. The accident 3 years ago had changed many things in the Turner household, but Grace's passion for automobiles had only intensified. Where other teenage girls might have posters of movie stars, Grace's bedroom walls were covered with engine diagrams and racing statistics. "This carburetor's from a '69 Camaro," Grace explained, adjusting the mixture screws with practiced precision. "The jets are different, but if I can get the air-fuel ratio just right, it should give us an extra 15 horsepower. Ray nodded appreciatively, understanding flowing between father and daughter in a language of torque specifications and compression ratios. Before the accident, he'd been Blue Ridge's most respected mechanic, capable of diagnosing problems by sound alone. The same crash that had damaged Grace's spine had left him with nerve damage in his right hand, forcing him to rely more heavily on his daughter's increasingly sophisticated mechanical knowledge. "Your brother called last night," Ray said carefully, knowing this topic always brought mixed emotions. "The entry deadline for the championship is next Friday." Grace's hands stilled on the wrench. The Blue Ridge Championship was the town's biggest event, drawing professional racers from across Texas and bringing much-needed revenue to local businesses. For weeks, Luke had been hinting about entering Grace's Mustang, but she'd avoided making any commitments. "I know what you're thinking," she said quietly, "but this car isn't ready for that level of competition. I'm still working with salvaged parts and improvised solutions. Those other drivers have sponsors and professional crews." "Maybe," Ray replied, crouching down to examine the engine block more closely, "but they don't have your mind. I've been working on cars for 3 decades, Grace, and I've never seen anyone understand mechanical systems the way you do." The compliment brought a small smile to Grace's face, but it was quickly overshadowed by familiar doubts. Outside the safety of her family's garage, the world had different opinions about her capabilities. At Blue Ridge High School, her wheelchair seemed to be the only thing people noticed, and her classmates' cruelty had taught her that expectations were usually disappointments waiting to happen. The sound of footsteps on gravel announced the arrival. of Grace's mother, Linda Turner, carrying a steaming cup of coffee and wearing the concerned expression that had become her default since the accident. As a part-time bookkeeper for 3 local businesses, Linda understood numbers and patterns, and the patterns she saw in their family's finances were increasingly troubling. "The insurance adjuster called again," Linda said, setting the coffee. "On a nearby workbench. They want to schedule another inspection of the shop." Ray's jaw tightened. The accident that had changed their family forever hadn't been their fault. A drunk driver had run a red light and slammed into their car while they were returning from a father-daughter trip to an auto show in Dallas. But insurance companies seemed determined to find reasons to reduce their coverage, and the medical bills continued to mount despite their supposed comprehensive policy. "What kind of inspection?" Grace asked, her mechanical intuition extending to reading the subtle tensions in her parents' voices. "They want to verify that the shop modifications for your wheelchair access were medically necessary," Linda explained, her tone carrying barely contained frustration. "As if you working here is somehow optional." Grace had insisted on making the garage fully accessible, refusing to let her disability limit her ability to pursue her passion. The modifications had cost nearly $8,000, money the family could barely afford, but had allowed her to continue developing the mechanical skills that gave her life meaning. "We'll deal with the insurance company," Ray said firmly. "Right now, let's focus on what we can control." The sound of a car engine growing louder outside interrupted their conversation. Through the open garage door, they could see Derek Shaw's pristine red Corvette pulling into the parking area, its custom exhaust system announcing his arrival with unnecessary loudness. Derek, 18 and the son of Blue Ridge's wealthiest car dealer, had never worked a day in his life, but considered himself an automotive expert because his father's money had bought him the fastest car in town. "Great," Grace muttered instinctively, moving her wheelchair slightly behind the Mustang's bulk. "What's he want?" Derek stepped out of his Corvette, wearing designer jeans and a polo shirt that probably cost more than the Turner family spent on groceries in a month. His perfectly styled hair and confident smirk suggested someone who'd never encountered a problem that money couldn't solve. Behind him emerged Brittany Wells, her blonde hair catching the morning sunlight and her expression carrying the particular brand of disdain that came naturally to Blue Ridge High's undisputed queen bee. "Well, well," Derek called out, his voice carrying across the garage with practiced arrogance. "Still working on your little science project, Grace?" Brittany giggled, a sound like wind chimes in a tornado. Pretty from a distance, but irritating up close. "Derek, be nice," she said with mock sweetness. "Grace is very dedicated to her hobby." Ray stepped protectively closer to his daughter, his expression darkening. "This is a working garage, kids. If you need something fixed, we can schedule an appointment." "Actually," Derek said, walking uninvited into the garage and circling Grace's Mustang like a shark scenting blood, "I heard some interesting rumors about this heap of junk, something about Luke wanting to race it." Grace felt her cheeks burning but forced herself to meet Derek's gaze directly. "It's not junk," she said quietly. "Every component has been carefully selected and modified for optimal performance." "Optimal performance," Derek laughed, the sound echoing off the garage walls. "Grace, this thing looks like it was assembled from a tornado's leftovers. My Corvette has more horsepower in its air conditioning system than this entire car." "Horsepower isn't everything," Grace replied, her voice gaining strength. "Weight distribution, aerodynamics, suspension geometry. There are dozens of factors that determine race performance." Brittany rolled her eyes dramatically. "Listen unto her talk," she said to Derek, "like she actually knows what any of that means." "I designed and built this engine myself," Grace said, her anger overriding her usual caution. "I calculated the compression ratios, selected the camshaft profile, and modified the intake manifold for maximum airflow efficiency." Derek's expression shifted from amusement to something darker. As someone whose mechanical knowledge extended only to knowing which key started his car, Grace's obvious expertise threatened his carefully constructed image as Blue Ridge's automotive authority. "Building something from garbage doesn't make you an engineer," he said coldly. "It makes you a scavenger. And everyone knows that real racing requires more than just wishful thinking and spare parts." "Real racing," Grace shot back, "requires understanding how machines actually work, not just buying the most expensive option." The tension in the garage was thick enough to cut with a wrench when Luke Turner appeared in the doorway, his work uniform bearing the logo of Morrison Construction, where he'd been employed since graduating high school the previous year. At 19, Luke had inherited his father's natural mechanical ability and his mother's steady temperament, but seeing his sister being harassed brought out his protective instincts immediately. "Everything okay in here?" Luke asked, his tone carefully neutral, but his eyes fixed on Derek. "Just admiring your sister's art project," Derek replied, his smirk returning. "Though I hear you're actually crazy enough to want to race this thing." Luke stepped closer, his presence filling the garage doorway. "Grace builds better cars than most people buy," he said simply. "And yeah, I'd be honored to drive anything she's engineered." "Your funeral," Brittany said with a laugh. "Literally. That death trap wouldn't last 5 minutes against real competition." "There's only one way to find out," Luke replied, his voice carrying a challenge that made Derek's eyes narrow. "You're serious about entering the championship?" Derek asked, disbelief mixing with anticipation in his voice. Grace looked between her brother and the two visitors, realizing that a moment of decision had arrived far sooner than she'd expected. The annual Blue Ridge Championship was held on a professional-grade track 30 miles outside town, and the winner traditionally received a trophy, $5,000 in prize money, and most importantly, the respect of everyone in Blue Ridge who cared about automobiles. "The entry fee is $500, Derek continued, his tone suggesting he knew this amount would be prohibitive for the Turner family. "Plus, you need current insurance and safety inspections. Think your family's budget can handle that?" The comment hit its intended target. $500 represented nearly a month of grocery money for the Turners, and everyone in the garage knew it. But something in Derek's mocking tone sparked a determination in Grace that surprised even her. "We'll manage," she said quietly, her hands moving instinctively to the Mustang's steering wheel. "This car will be ready." "Grace," her mother started, concern evident in her voice. "It will be ready," Grace repeated louder this time. "And when Luke wins that championship, maybe people will understand that innovation matters more than money." Derek's laugh was sharp and unpleasant. "When Luke loses spectacularly, you mean? But hey, at least it'll be entertaining watching your junkyard special fall apart on the first turn." "Get out," Ray said suddenly, his voice carrying 30 years of suppressed frustration. "Now?" Derek raised his hands in mock surrender. "No problem. We just wanted to make sure you knew what you were getting into." He paused at the garage entrance, turning back with a grin that contained no warmth. "By the way, Grace, the whole school's already talking about this. They can't wait to see the crippled girl's car crash and burn." The silence that followed Derek and Brittany's departure was deafening. Grace stared at her hands, which were trembling, slightly despite her efforts to remain composed. The word crippled hung in the air like exhaust fumes, poisoning everything it touched. "That boy needs to learn some manners," Ray said quietly, his own hands clenched into fists. "He's not wrong about the money," Linda said practically, though her voice carried its own edge of anger. $500 plus safety equipment we don't have." "We'll find a way," Luke said, moving to stand beside his sister's wheelchair. "Grace has put too much work into this car to let Derek Shaw and his attitude stop us." Grace looked up at her family, seeing determination mixed with worry in their faces. Outside, Derek's Corvette roared to life with its customary theatrical flourish, but the sound that had once intimidated her now simply sounded excessive and wasteful. "I need to run some calculations," she said finally, her voice steadying as she focused on the mechanical challenges ahead. "If we're really doing this, I need to optimize everything. Weight reduction, gear ratios, suspension settings, every component has to be perfect." "What do you need?" Luke asked. Grace wheeled herself closer to the Mustang, her trained eye cataloging modifications that would be necessary for competitive racing. "Time," she said simply, "and about 1,000 small miracles." As her family began discussing logistics and possibilities, Grace placed her hand on the Mustang's fender and felt the solid reality of metal and dreams made manifest. 3 years ago, a drunk driver had taken away her ability to walk, but he hadn't touched her mind or her determination. This car represented more than transportation or competition. It was proof that she could still build something meaningful in a world that increasingly treated her as less than whole. The championship was 6 weeks away. 6 weeks to transform a collection of salvaged parts and improvised solutions into something capable of competing against professionally built race cars. 6 weeks to prove that innovation and intelligence could triumph over money and prejudice. Grace Turner had built her entire life around solving impossible mechanical problems. Now she faced the biggest challenge yet, proving to Blue Ridge, Texas, and most importantly to herself, that being in a wheelchair didn't mean accepting limitations on her dreams. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The Blue Ridge High School parking lot buzzed with Monday morning energy as students gathered around Derek Shaw's Corvette, its red paint gleaming under the Texas sun like a beacon of teenage aspiration. Grace Turner maneuvered her wheelchair through the crowd, her backpack loaded with mechanical engineering textbooks that most of her classmates couldn't even pronounce, let alone understand. The weekend had given her time to process Derek's challenge, and she'd spent every waking hour calculating gear ratios and suspension geometries in preparation for what lay ahead. "There she is," Brittany Wells announced loudly as Grace approached the school entrance, her voice carrying the particular tone that preceded public humiliation. Blue Ridge's very own car designer. A circle of students formed naturally around Brittany, drawn by the promise of entertainment at someone else's expense. Grace had learned to navigate these social minefields with the same precision she applied to mechanical problems, but Derek's weekend boast about the upcoming championship had apparently spread through the school's gossip network like oil through an engine. "Tell us about your race car, Grace," Brittany continued, her smile as sharp as broken glass. "I heard it's going to revolutionize motorsports." Grace stopped her wheelchair and looked directly at Brittany, refusing to be intimidated, despite the dozen pairs of eyes now focused on her. "It's a 1967 Mustang Fastback with a modified 302 Windsor V8, she said calmly. "I've rebuilt the engine with a custom camshaft profile and modified the intake manifold for improved airflow dynamics." Several students exchanged glances, clearly lost by Grace's technical language, but reluctant to admit their ignorance. Derek pushed through the crowd, his designer jacket marking him as the undisputed leader of Blue Ridge's social hierarchy. "Sounds impressive," Derek said with mock appreciation. "But didn't you build this amazing machine out of junkyard scraps? I mean, professional race teams spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on their cars. Money doesn't create engineering. Expertise," Grace replied. "Understanding mechanical principles does." "Right," Derek laughed, turning to address his audience rather than Grace. "Because everyone knows that real race cars are built by high school girls in their daddy's garage. The laughter that followed felt like sandpaper against Grace's nerves, but she'd endured worse in the 3 years since her accident. What bothered her more was seeing Stone Reed standing at the edge of the crowd, his expression uncomfortable, but his silence complete. Stone had been her lab partner in physics class the previous semester, and she knew he understood the complexity of what she'd accomplished. But social pressure apparently outweighed scientific curiosity. "Actually," a new voice interrupted, causing heads to turn in surprise. "Some of the most significant automotive innovations have come from independent builders working with limited resources." Mr. Gary Fields emerged from the faculty parking area, his weathered hands carrying a cup of coffee and 30 years of teaching experience that had taught him to recognize genuine talent, regardless of its packaging. As Blue Ridge High's shop, teacher and the sponsor of the automotive club, Mr. Fields had watched Grace's mechanical abilities develop with growing amazement. The original Ford GT40 program started with a small team of engineers working in unconventional conditions. Mr. Fields continued, his authoritative tone causing the student crowd to shift uncomfortably. "Innovation often comes from people who can't afford to buy their way out of problems." Derek's expression darkened at having his narrative challenged by a teacher. "With respect, Mr. Fields, there's a difference between professional engineers and hobbyists." "There certainly is," Mr. Fields agreed. "Professional engineers are constrained by budgets, corporate politics, and design committees. Independent builders can focus purely on performance and innovation." Grace felt a surge of gratitude toward her teacher, but she also recognized the dangerous position his support put him in. Blue Ridge was a small town where Derek's father held considerable influence, and teachers who crossed the Shaw family often found their employment situations becoming complicated. "We should probably get to class," Stone Reed said quietly, clearly uncomfortable with the tension crackling between Derek and Mr. Fields. "Good idea," Brittany agreed, but her tone suggested the conversation was far from over. "We wouldn't want to miss any important lessons about automotive engineering." As the crowd dispersed, Grace found herself alone with Mr. Fields, who waited until the other students were out of earshot before speaking. "How's the Mustang coming along?" he asked quietly. "The engine's running well," Grace replied, "but I'm concerned about the transmission. The original C4 automatic isn't ideal for racing, but a manual conversion would require components I can't afford." Mr. Fields nodded thoughtfully. "Have you considered modifying the existing transmission? Changing the valve body and torque converter could give you better performance characteristics." "I've run the calculations," Grace said, her mind automatically shifting into technical mode. A modified valve body would improve shift timing, but the torque converter's stall speed is still too high for optimal acceleration. "What about a custom torque converter?" Mr. Fields suggested. "I know someone who might be able to help with that." Grace's eyes brightened with interest, but years of disappointment had taught her to be cautious about offers that seemed too good to be true. "I couldn't afford to pay for custom work." "Let me make some calls," Mr. Fields said with a smile. "The racing community is smaller than you might think, and good engineering deserves support." The first bell rang, signaling the start of another day of academic routine that felt increasingly irrelevant compared to the mechanical challenges waiting in her family's garage. Grace made her way through the hallways of Blue Ridge High, navigating both the physical obstacles of wheelchair accessibility and the social landmines of teenage hierarchy. In her first period American history class, Grace tried to focus on the lesson about westward expansion, but her mind kept drifting to suspension geometry and tire compound selections. Mrs. Patterson, the history teacher, had always been kind to Grace, but like most of her instructors, she seemed to view her automotive interests as an unusual hobby rather than a serious pursuit. "Miss Turner," Mrs. Patterson said, causing Grace to snap back to attention. Can you tell us about the significance of the Transcontinental Railroad? In American development, it connected previously isolated regions and enabled the efficient transportation of goods and people across vast distances. Grace replied automatically, though her mind was still calculating gear ratios. Exactly, Mrs. Patterson smiled. Transportation infrastructure has always been crucial to American progress. The comment resonated more deeply than Mrs. Patterson probably intended. Grace realized that her Mustang represented more than personal vindication. It was part of a long tradition of American innovation that had always depended on individuals willing to push boundaries and challenge conventional wisdom. During lunch period, Grace wheeled herself to the library, seeking the quiet refuge of technical journals and engineering textbooks. The librarian, Mrs. Parker, had always been supportive of Grace's academic interests and had helped her access specialized automotive publications through interlibrary loans. "I have something that might interest you," Mrs. Parker said, producing a recent issue of Race Car Engineering magazine. "There's an article about aerodynamic modifications for vintage muscle cars." Grace accepted the magazine gratefully, immediately. Flipping to the relevant article, the technical diagrams and mathematical formulas felt like a foreign language that she happened to speak fluently, offering insights that could potentially give her Mustang a competitive edge. "Thank you," Grace said sincerely. "This could be really helpful. I also wanted to tell you," Mrs. Parker continued quietly, "that I think what you're doing is remarkable. My late husband was a mechanic, and he always said that understanding engines was like understanding poetry. It required both technical knowledge and creative intuition." The unexpected compliment brought tears to Grace's eyes. In a world where most people saw only her wheelchair and limitations, Mrs. Parker recognized the depth of her passion and capabilities. The afternoon brought physics class with Mr. Thompson, where Grace finally felt intellectually engaged. The lesson on thermodynamics had direct applications to internal combustion engines, and Grace found herself answering questions that stumped most of her classmates. "Excellent explanation, Grace," Mr. Thompson said after she described the relationship between compression ratios and thermal efficiency. "Have you considered pursuing mechanical engineering in college?" The question hung in the air like exhaust fumes. Grace had dreamed of studying engineering since middle school, but the financial realities of her family's situation made college seem increasingly unlikely. Even with academic scholarships, the cost of room, board, and accessibility modifications could easily exceed what her family could afford. "I'm still exploring options," Grace replied diplomatically. After school, Grace made her way to the parking lot, where Luke waited in their father's weathered pickup truck. The contrast between their practical transportation and Derek's flashy Corvette served as a daily reminder of the economic disparities that defined much of their social environment. "How was school?" Luke asked as he helped Grace transfer from her wheelchair to the passenger seat. "Educational," Grace replied dryly. "Derek's apparently told everyone about the championship. I'm either going to be vindicated or humiliated in front of the entire town. No pressure, right?" Luke grinned, but Grace could see the concern in his eyes. The drive home through Blue Ridge's tree-lined streets gave Grace time to process the day's events. Their town had been built around agriculture and small manufacturing, but economic changes had left many families struggling to maintain middle-class lifestyles. The Turner family's situation wasn't unique, but it was complicated by medical expenses that continued to mount despite insurance coverage. At Turner Auto Repair, Ray was finishing work on a customer's sedan when they arrived. His movements were more deliberate than they'd been before the accident, accommodating the nerve damage that had forced him to modify his approach to mechanical work. "How'd the old girl run today?" Grace asked, referring to their pickup truck. "Started. Complaining about second gear again," Ray replied. "I think the synchronizer's going." Grace nodded. automatically calculating the cost of transmission repairs that they couldn't afford. The pickup truck was essential for their business, but like everything else in their lives, it required constant attention and creative problem-solving to keep functioning. I talked to Walt Hayes today, Ray continued, mentioning Blue Ridge's most respected veteran mechanic. He heard about the championship through the grapevine. What did he say? Luke asked. He wants to see the Mustang, Ray replied with a slight smile. Walt doesn't waste time on lost causes. Grace felt a flutter of excitement mixed with nervousness. Walt Motor Hayes was a legend in Blue Ridge racing circles, a man whose mechanical expertise was respected throughout East Texas. His interest in her project could legitimize her efforts in ways that no amount of technical explanation could. Achieve when? Grace asked. This weekend, Ray said. He's coming by Saturday morning. The remainder of the week passed in a blur of classes, calculations, and late-night work sessions in the garage. Grace found herself caught between two worlds: the academic environment where her intelligence was recognized, but her automotive passion was viewed as eccentric, and the mechanical realm where her disability seemed irrelevant compared to her. Growing expertise, Friday afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to Turner Auto Repair. Diana Scott, Grace's former physical therapist and current family friend, arrived with coffee and the kind of concerned expression that usually preceded difficult conversations. "How's our favorite engineer?" Diana asked, setting down the coffee and examining Grace's latest modifications to the Mustang suspension system. "Stressed," Grace admitted. "I keep finding problems that need solving, and the championship is getting closer every day." Diana nodded understandingly. As a physical therapist, she'd worked with many patients who struggled to find new sources of meaning and purpose after life-changing injuries. Grace's automotive passion had been crucial to her psychological recovery, providing goals that extended far beyond mere physical adaptation. "I wanted to talk to you about something," Diana said carefully. "I've been following your progress with this car, and I think you're doing something really important." "Important how?" Grace asked. "You're proving that disability doesn't define capability," Diana replied. "There are a lot of young people in similar situations who need to see that. Their dreams don't have to die because their bodies changed." The weight of Diana's words settled over Grace like a heavy blanket. She'd been so focused on the technical challenges of building a competitive race car that she hadn't fully considered the broader implications of her efforts. Her success or failure would resonate far beyond Blue Ridge's racing community. "No pressure, right?" Grace said, echoing Luke's earlier comment. "All the pressure in the world," Diana replied with a smile. "But also all the support you need. This community is starting to rally behind you, even if some people are too proud to admit it yet." As Diana left and the garage settled into its familiar evening routine, Grace positioned herself beside her Mustang and ran her hands along its custom-fabricated components. Each piece represented hours of calculation, fabrication, and problem-solving that had pushed her abilities to their limits. Tomorrow, Walt Hayes would examine her work with the critical eye of someone who'd been building race cars since before Grace was born. The next 6 weeks would determine whether 3 years of determination and innovation had been enough to transform salvaged parts and teenage dreams into something capable of competing against professional race teams. But tonight, surrounded by the tools and materials that had become extensions of her own creativity, Grace Turner felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that made engines run cleaner and hearts beat faster. Grace had been awake since 5, methodically checking every system on her Mustang and ensuring that every component would present itself at peak performance for Walt Hayes' inspection. The legendary mechanic's reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning. If Walt declared her work worthy, doors would open. If he found it lacking, word would spread through Blue Ridge's automotive community faster than gossip through a church congregation. Ray Turner stood beside his daughter in the garage, nervously adjusting tools that were already perfectly organized. Both father and daughter understood that this moment represented more than mechanical evaluation. It was a test of whether Grace's unconventional approach to engineering would be accepted by the old guard of Blue Ridge racing culture. "Remember," Ray said quietly, "Walt's seen everything twice. He won't be impressed by fancy talk or excuses, but he respects honest work and innovative thinking." Grace nodded, her hands unconsciously smoothing down her cleanest work shirt. She'd debated whether to dress up for this meeting, but ultimately decided that authenticity mattered more than appearance. This was her garage, her project, and her moment to prove that brilliance could emerge from unexpected places. The rumble of a classic engine announced Walt's arrival before his 1970 Plymouth Cuda appeared in the garage doorway. The car's deep purple paint gleamed like liquid amethyst, and its aggressive stance suggested the kind of power that made lesser vehicles seem like toys. Walt emerged from the driver's seat with the deliberate movements of a man whose 70-year-old body still carried the confidence of someone who'd never met a mechanical problem he couldn't solve. "Morning, Ray," Walt said, his voice carrying the gravelly texture of someone who'd spent decades breathing exhaust fumes and talking over running engines. "And you must be Grace." "Yes, sir," Grace replied, wheeling forward to offer her hand. Walt's handshake was firm and calloused, the grip of someone who'd earned respect through decades of practical accomplishment rather than inherited wealth or social connections. "Heard interesting things about your project," Walt continued, his keen eyes already scanning the Mustang with the methodical precision of a surgeon examining a patient. "Mind if I take a look?" "Please," Grace said, gesturing toward her car with a mixture of pride and nervousness. Walt began his inspection at the front end, immediately dropping to his knees to examine the suspension modifications Grace had fabricated. From salvaged components, his weathered hands traced the custom control arms and modified geometry with the delicate touch of someone reading Braille. "This is interesting work," Walt murmured, his tone giving nothing away. "You fabricated these yourself?" "Yes, sir," Grace replied. "The original suspension was designed for comfort and cost savings. I modified the geometry to reduce body roll and improve tire contact during cornering." Walt nodded thoughtfully, moving to examine the brake system modifications. Grace had upgraded to larger rotors and performance calipers salvaged from a wrecked sports car, but the real innovation was in her custom brake bias adjustment system that allowed for fine-tuning during different racing conditions. "Tell me about your brake setup," Walt said, his inspection growing more detailed. Grace launched into a technical explanation of brake thermal dynamics and weight transfer characteristics, her confidence growing as she discussed the mathematical principles behind her modifications. Walt listened intently, occasionally asking probing questions that revealed his own deep understanding of racing physics. "And the engine?" Walt asked, moving to the Mustang's heart. Grace opened the hood, with the pride of an artist unveiling a masterpiece. The 302 Windsor V8 gleamed under the garage lights, its custom components integrated seamlessly with production parts in a symphony of functional beauty. Every component had been selected, modified, or fabricated with specific performance goals in mind. "It's a 68 block that I rebuilt with forged internals," Grace explained. "The heads are from a 70 Boss 302, ported and polished. I designed the intake manifold myself and had it fabricated by Morrison Machine Shop." Walt's eyebrows rose slightly at the mention of Morrison Machine Shop, Blue Ridge's most respected precision manufacturing facility. "Tom Morrison did this work for you?" "He let me use his equipment after hours," Grace admitted. "I did the actual machining myself under his supervision. Tom's particular about who he trusts with his machinery, Walt observed, running his finger along the intake manifold's smooth surfaces. This is professional quality work. The compliment sent warmth through Grace's chest, but Walt wasn't finished with his examination. He spent nearly an hour inspecting every system, asking technical questions that would have stumped most professional mechanics and receiving answers that demonstrated Grace's comprehensive understanding of automotive engineering principles. "What are you hoping to achieve with this car?" Walt asked finally, straightening up and fixing Grace with a direct stare. "I want to prove that engineering excellence matters more than budget size," Grace replied honestly. "Everyone assumes that money and connections determine racing success, but innovation and understanding should count for something." Walt studied her face for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Racing's a tough business, Grace. Lots of money, big egos, and people who don't like having their assumptions challenged." "I understand that, sir," Grace said, "but I also understand that this car is capable of competitive performance if it's driven properly. Your brother's the driver. Luke's been racing go-karts and dirt track cars since he was 12, Grace replied. "He understands the car's capabilities and limitations." Walt nodded slowly, then walked around the Mustang one more time, his trained eye cataloging details that would escape casual observation. When he finished his circuit, he turned to face both Grace and Ray with an expression that had shifted from skepticism to something approaching respect. "I've been building and racing cars for 50 years, Walt said quietly. "I've worked with factory teams, professional drivers, and millionaire hobbyists with unlimited budgets. What you've accomplished here, Grace, is remarkable." Grace felt her heart skip a beat, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "The engineering is sound, the fabrication is excellent, and the attention to detail is professional grade," Walt continued. "This car will be competitive in the championship, assuming it's properly prepared and driven." "You really think so?" Ray asked, his voice carrying years of suppressed pride in his daughter's abilities. "I know so," Walt replied firmly. "But Grace, you need to understand what you're getting into. Derek Shaw's been running his mouth around town, and a lot of people are placing bets on this race. Some folks want to see you succeed, but others are hoping you'll fail spectacularly." "I'm not doing this for other people," Grace said. "I'm doing it to prove something to myself." "Good answer," Walt smiled. "But you're also going to be representing something bigger than yourself. Every person in this town who's ever been told they can't achieve something because of their circumstances is going to be watching your car on that track." The weight of Walt's words settled over the garage like a heavy blanket. Grace had understood that her project carried personal significance, but she was beginning to realize that her success or failure would resonate throughout Blue Ridge's entire community. "What do I need to do?" Grace asked. "First, you need proper safety equipment," Walt replied practically. "Roll cage, racing harness, fire suppression system. Everything has to meet track specifications." Grace's heart sank slightly as she calculated the cost of professional safety equipment. Even used racing components were expensive, and their family's budget was already stretched to its limits. "Second," Walt continued, "you need track time. This car's never been raced, and Luke needs to understand its handling characteristics before he goes up against professional drivers." "The track charges $200 per hour for practice sessions," Ray said quietly. "I might be able to help with that," Walt replied. "I know the track owner, and he's always interested in supporting genuine talent." Grace looked between Walt and her father, hardly daring to hope that solutions might exist for problems that had seemed insurmountable. "Why would you help us?" Grace asked directly. Walt was quiet for a moment, his weathered face reflecting decades of experience with dreams deferred and talents wasted. "Because 40 years ago, I was a young mechanic with big ideas and no money. A few people took chances on me when they didn't have to, and it made all the difference. What happened to them? Grace asked. Some succeeded, some failed, but all of them made the racing community better by supporting innovation over politics. Walt replied, "It's time for someone to return the favor." The garage fell silent, except for the distant sound of traffic on Blue Ridge's main street. Grace felt the weight of opportunity and responsibility settling on her shoulders like a racing harness, protective but confining, essential but heavy. "There's something else you need to know," Walt continued, his tone becoming more serious. "Derek Shaw's father has been making calls around the racing community. He's not pleased about this competition, and he's using his influence to make things difficult." "What kind of difficulties?" Ray asked, his protective instincts immediately aroused. "Technical inspections, safety certifications, entry requirements. Richard Shaw has connections with racing officials, and he's not above using them to protect his son's reputation," Walt explained. Grace felt anger flare in her chest, but it was quickly replaced by determination. She'd faced skepticism and discrimination for 3 years. Corrupt politics were just another obstacle to overcome. "We'll meet every requirement," Grace said firmly. "Whatever they want to throw at us, this car will pass inspection." "I believe it will," Walt agreed, "but you need to be prepared for challenges that have nothing to do with automotive engineering." Luke chose that moment to arrive home from his construction job, his work clothes dusty and his face tired but curious about the classic Cuda parked in their driveway. Walt spent the next hour evaluating Luke's driving experience and understanding of racing fundamentals, asking questions about vehicle dynamics and race strategy that revealed both his expertise and Luke's natural aptitude. "You've got good instincts," Walt told Luke finally, "but racing's different from street driving or even go-karts. You'll need professional instruction before you're ready for championship-level competition." "How much does that cost?" Luke asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer would be prohibitive. "Normally, about $500 per day," Walt replied. "But I might know someone who'd be willing to work for trade, rather than cash." Grace and Luke exchanged glances, understanding that Walt was offering opportunities that could transform their situation if they were brave enough to accept them. "What kind of trade?" Grace asked. "Your engineering expertise," Walt replied. "I've got a '67 Camaro that's been giving me trouble with its fuel injection system. Modern electronics and old-school mechanics don't always get along." Grace's mind immediately began processing the implications. Fuel injection systems were complex electronic devices that required both mechanical understanding and computer knowledge. Exactly the kind of challenge that played to her strengths. "I'd be happy to look at it," Grace said. "Good," Walt smiled, "because if you can solve my problem, I can solve yours. Fair trade?" As Walt prepared to leave, he offered one final piece of advice that would stick with Grace through all the challenges ahead. "Remember," he said, "racing isn't just about building the fastest car or finding the best driver. It's about solving problems under pressure and adapting to circumstances you can't control. You've already proven you can do both of those things." After Walt's departure, the Turner family stood in their garage, surrounded by tools, dreams, and the growing realization that their small project had evolved into something with implications far beyond their initial imagination. The Mustang sat silent among them, no longer just a collection of salvaged parts, but a symbol of possibility that could reshape how their entire community understood the relationship between limitation and achievement. Grace placed her hand on the car's fender and felt the solid reality of 3 years' worth of determination made manifest in steel and aluminum. In 6 weeks, this machine would either vindicate everything she'd worked for or become another cautionary tale about the dangers of dreaming too big. But for the first time since Derek Shaw had issued his challenge, Grace Turner felt genuinely confident that her engineering would prove stronger than his money. The following Monday brought an unexpected visitor to Blue Ridge High School in the form of a sleek black sedan with government plates that whispered authority and demanded attention. Grace noticed the car during lunch period as she made her way across the campus courtyard, its presence feeling somehow ominous against the backdrop of teenage normalcy. By the time she reached the library, rumors were already circulating through the student body like wildfire through dry grass. "I heard it's about college recruitment," Madison Clark whispered to her friend near the reference desk. "Someone said a military academy is interested in one of our students." Grace tried to focus on her advanced calculus homework, but the mysterious Sedan's presence nagged at her concentration like an engine with a timing problem. Her intuition, finely tuned by 3 years of navigating unexpected challenges, suggested that this visit would somehow intersect with her own circumstances. The answer came during 7th period, when Principal Helen Ward's voice crackled through the classroom intercom with the carefully neutral tone that preceded significant announcements. "Grace Turner, please report to the principal's office immediately." The request sent a ripple of curiosity through her physics class, where Grace had been demonstrating thermodynamic principles that directly applied to internal combustion engine efficiency. Mr. Thompson gave her an encouraging nod as she gathered her books, but his expression carried the kind of concern that teachers developed when their students attracted administrative attention. The journey to Principal Ward's office felt longer than usual, her wheelchair's familiar rhythm echoing through hallways that suddenly seemed charged with anticipation. Grace had never been in serious trouble at school. Her academic performance was exemplary and her behavior beyond reproach. But the sedan's presence suggested that this meeting would address matters far beyond typical student concerns. "Principal." Ward greeted Grace with a warm but nervous smile, her usual professional composure slightly strained by whatever conversation had preceded this summons. Seated across from the principal's desk was a woman in her early 40s, wearing a crisp business suit and the kind of confident bearing that suggested federal employment. "Grace, I'd like you to meet Dr. Sarah Mitchell from the Department of Education's Office of Educational Research and Improvement," Principal Ward said carefully. "She's here to discuss some very interesting opportunities." Dr. Mitchell stood and extended her hand with the kind of firm handshake that Grace had learned to associate with people who took her seriously despite her age and disability. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Grace. I've been reading about your automotive engineering project with great interest." Grace accepted the handshake while her mind raced through possible explanations for federal interest in her Mustang. "Thank you, Ma'am. May I ask how you learned about my project?" "Your physics teacher, Mr. Thompson, submitted your thermodynamics research paper to a national competition," Dr. Mitchell explained, settling back into her chair. "The mathematical modeling you applied to engine efficiency optimization caught the attention of several engineering departments." The revelation hit Grace like a perfectly timed gear shift, surprising but somehow inevitable. She remembered spending weeks on that paper, treating it as a practical exploration of the theories she was implementing in her Mustang's engine design. Mr. Thompson had praised her work, but she'd never imagined it would attract attention beyond Blue Ridge High School. "Your paper demonstrates graduate-level understanding of complex engineering principles," Dr. Mitchell continued. "Combined with the practical application you've achieved in your racing project, you represent exactly the kind of innovative thinking that American engineering programs need to cultivate." Principal Ward leaned forward with obvious pride. "Dr. Mitchell is here to discuss scholarship opportunities that could change your entire future, Grace." The word scholarship hung in the air like exhaust fumes, carrying implications that Grace, hardly dared to contemplate. College had always seemed like a distant dream, limited by financial realities that made even state universities feel prohibitively expensive. "What kind of opportunities?" Grace asked carefully. Dr. Mitchell opened her briefcase and produced a folder thick with official documents. MIT, Stanford, Georgia Tech, and Carnegie Mellon have all expressed interest in offering you full academic scholarships. Additionally, the National Science Foundation is prepared to provide research funding for continued development of your automotive innovations. Grace felt the world shift around her like a car taking a high-speed turn. These were institutions she'd only dreamed of attending, engineering programs that represented the absolute pinnacle of American technical education. The financial value of what Dr. Mitchell was describing exceeded her family's total income for several years. "There is one condition," Dr. Mitchell continued, her tone becoming more serious. "The scholarships are contingent upon your successful completion of high school and demonstration of your practical engineering capabilities." "You mean the championship race?" Grace said, understanding immediately. "The racing competition has become something of a case study in our department," Dr. Mitchell explained. "Your approach to engineering challenges, working with limited resources, and overcoming systemic barriers represents exactly the kind of problem-solving ability that drives technological innovation." Principal Ward nodded enthusiastically. "Grace, this is an unprecedented opportunity. These schools don't usually recruit students until their senior year, but your combination of academic excellence and practical application has impressed some very important people." Grace's mind struggled to process the magnitude of what she was hearing. 3 years ago, her life had been shattered by a drunk driver's decision to ignore a red light. Now that same tragedy had somehow led to circumstances that could transform her entire future. "What happens if I don't win the championship?" Grace asked directly. Dr. Mitchell smiled. "Grace, these universities aren't interested in you because they think you'll win a local racing competition. They're interested because you've demonstrated the ability to innovate under pressure and solve complex problems with limited resources. Whether your brother finishes first or 15th, your engineering accomplishments speak for themselves." The conversation continued for another hour, covering academic requirements, research opportunities, and the kind of career path that Grace had never dared to imagine as realistic possibilities. By the time Dr. Mitchell departed, leaving behind application materials and contact information, Grace felt as though her entire understanding of her own potential had been fundamentally recalibrated. The drive home with Luke provided time to process the afternoon's revelations. Blue Ridge's familiar streets looked different now, like scenery from a life she was preparing to leave behind rather than the permanent landscape of her future. "Federal recruiters," Luke said, shaking his head in amazement. "My little sister's being recruited by the federal government. It doesn't feel real," Grace admitted. 3 hours ago, my biggest worry was whether we could afford racing tires. Now I'm supposed to choose between MIT and Stanford." "You've earned this, Grace," Luke said seriously. "Everything you've accomplished, all the work you've put into that car, this is what it was leading to." At Turner Auto Repair, Grace found her parents deep in conversation with Walt Hayes, their expressions mixing excitement with the kind of careful concern that parents developed when their children's opportunities exceeded their own experience. Walt's presence suggested that news of Dr. Mitchell's visit had already reached Blue Ridge's automotive community. "Heard you had an interesting day at school," Walt said with a grin that couldn't quite hide his obvious pride. "Word travels fast." "In a small town," Grace replied, transferring from the pickup truck to her wheelchair with practiced efficiency. "Tom Morrison called me an hour ago," Ray explained. "Apparently, Dr. Mitchell stopped by his machine shop asking about your work on the intake manifold. She was very impressed with his description of your manufacturing capabilities." "Linda Turner." emerged from the garage office with tears in her eyes and the kind of smile that mothers reserved for moments when their children exceeded every expectation. "Grace, honey, do you understand what this means?" "It means I have choices I never thought I'd have," Grace replied honestly. "But it also means more pressure to prove myself worthy of these opportunities." Walt stepped closer, his weathered face serious. "Grace, I want you to understand something important. These universities aren't offering you charity or making allowances for your circumstances. They're recruiting you because you're genuinely exceptional at what you do." "But what if the championship goes badly?" Grace asked, voicing the fear that had been growing in her mind. "What if all this attention backfires?" "Then you'll learn from the experience and move forward," Walt replied. "Real engineers don't succeed because they never fail. They succeed because they learn from failure and keep innovating." The remainder of the week passed in a blur of academic routine that felt increasingly surreal, given the magnitude of the opportunities now within Grace's reach. Her teachers, apparently briefed by Principal Ward, began treating her with a mixture of pride and amazement that made her feel simultaneously honored and uncomfortable. Derek Shaw's reaction to news of Grace's recruitment was predictably bitter. During Thursday's lunch period, he cornered her near the vending machines with the kind of aggressive posture that had once intimidated her, but now seemed merely petulant. "So I hear you're some kind of genius now," Derek said, his tone carrying barely concealed resentment. "Amazing what sympathy can accomplish." "The universities aren't offering sympathy scholarships," Grace replied calmly. "They're recruiting engineering talent." "Right," Derek laughed harshly, "because building a car from junkyard scraps is exactly what MIT is looking for." "Actually," Grace said, her confidence bolstered by a week of validation from genuine experts, "innovation with limited resources is exactly what they're looking for. Anyone can build something impressive with unlimited money." Derek's expression darkened as her words hit their intended target. "We'll see how impressive your innovation looks when it falls apart on the track." "I guess we will," Grace agreed. "But win or lose, my engineering speaks for itself." The encounter left Grace feeling oddly liberated. Derek's attempts at intimidation no longer carried the sting they once had, neutralized by the growing recognition that her worth wasn't determined by the opinions of insecure teenagers with inherited advantages. Friday afternoon brought another visit from Walt Hayes, this time accompanied by a surprise that would accelerate Grace's preparation timeline dramatically. Behind his CUDA, he towed a professional racing trailer containing safety equipment that represented thousands of dollars in specialized components. "Where did this come from?" Ray asked, examining the roll cage components with obvious amazement. "Racing community takes care of its own," Walt replied simply. Word got out about Grace's project, and some folks decided to contribute equipment they're not using anymore. Grace felt overwhelmed by the generosity of people she'd never met, fellow enthusiasts who understood the significance of what she was attempting and wanted to support innovation regardless of its source. "This is too much," Grace protested. "I can't accept charity." "It's not charity," Walt corrected. "It's investment. Every person who contributed something to this collection believes you're going to accomplish something important, and they want to be part of it." The weekend was spent installing safety equipment and fine-tuning systems that would determine not only race performance, but Luke's survival in the event of an accident. Grace approached each component with the meticulous attention to detail that had become her trademark, understanding that lives literally depended on the quality of her work. Sunday evening found the Turner family gathered around their kitchen table, surrounded by scholarship applications and racing preparation schedules that represented two different paths toward the same destination, proving that talent and determination could overcome circumstances that others viewed as insurmountable limitations. 5 weeks until the championship. Linda said, reviewing the calendar with the careful precision of someone accustomed to managing complex schedules. 5 weeks to finish everything we've started, Grace corrected, looking through the window, toward the garage, where her Mustang waited for final preparations. Outside, Blue Ridge settled into its familiar evening routine, a small Texas town where big dreams usually withered under the weight of practical limitations. But in the Turner family garage, surrounded by tools and possibilities, those limitations were being systematically dismantled by a 17-year-old girl who refused to accept that her circumstances defined her potential. The next 5 weeks would determine whether 3 years of determination and innovation had been sufficient to transform tragedy into triumph. But Grace Turner had already achieved something more valuable than any racing victory. She had proven to herself that the only limitations that truly mattered were the ones she chose to accept. The Blue Ridge Speedway stretched before them like a ribbon of asphalt dreams, its professional-grade surface gleaming under the early morning Texas sun. Grace had seen the track countless times from the spectator stands, but viewing it from pit lane while seated beside her own race car created an entirely different emotional landscape. Her Mustang looked small and humble, surrounded by the transporters and professional equipment of the established racing teams. But Grace felt a surge of pride, knowing that every component had been selected and installed according to her precise engineering calculations. "First time's always overwhelming," Walt Hayes said, approaching with 2 cups of coffee and the kind of calm confidence that came from 50 years of racing experience. "Track looks different when you're down here with the real competitors, doesn't it?" Grace accepted the coffee gratefully, her hands slightly trembling from a mixture of caffeine and nervous anticipation. This morning represented her first opportunity to see whether 3 years of theoretical engineering would translate into actual track performance. "I've run computer simulations of this track layout," Grace said, her eyes scanning the banked turns and elevation changes, "but theoretical models can't account for every variable. That's why we test," Walt replied. "Real racing happens in the gap between what you can calculate and what you can't predict." Luke emerged from the Mustang's cockpit, wearing his new racing suit and helmet, the professional safety equipment transforming him from Grace's older brother into something that looked remarkably like a legitimate race car driver. The past 2 weeks had been spent installing the donated safety equipment, and Grace had approached each component with the meticulous attention to detail that characterized all her work. "How does it feel?" Grace asked, referring to both the car's ergonomics and Luke's emotional state. "Like sitting inside a very sophisticated weapon," Luke replied honestly. "Everything's exactly where it should be, but I can feel how much power this thing is carrying." Grace had spent months optimizing the Mustang's power-to-weight ratio, but seeing her brother strapped into the vehicle made the abstract concepts of kinetic energy and momentum feel suddenly concrete and dangerous. Racing was inherently risky, and all her engineering expertise couldn't eliminate the possibility that her pursuit of vindication might cost her family something irreplaceable. "Remember," Walt said, addressing Luke with the authority of someone who'd mentored dozens of drivers, "this first session is about learning the car, not setting lap records. Build speed gradually and focus on smooth inputs." The track official's voice crackled through the pit lane speakers, announcing the beginning of the morning practice session. Grace watched with breathless attention as Luke guided her Mustang onto the racing surface for its first competitive laps, the engine note changing character as it moved from idle to operational load. Through the gap in the pit wall, Grace could see Derek Shaw's red Corvette already circulating at impressive speed, its professional modifications and unlimited budget evident in its aggressive cornering and smooth acceleration. Derek had arrived at the track with a crew of paid technicians and enough spare parts to rebuild his entire car twice. a stark contrast to the Turner family's single-car operation. "Luke's being smart," Walt observed, watching Grace's brother take conservative racing lines while familiarizing himself with the Mustang's handling characteristics. "A lot of first-time drivers try to go fast immediately and end up in the wall." Grace focused her attention on the data streaming from the simple telemetry system she'd installed, watching engine temperatures and pressures that would reveal whether her theoretical calculations matched real-world performance. The numbers look good. Oil pressure steady, coolant temperature within acceptable ranges, and fuel consumption matching her projections. "Tell me what you're seeing," Walt said, recognizing Grace's analytical focus. "Engine parameters are nominal," Grace replied, her eyes tracking multiple data streams simultaneously. "The cooling system is managing thermal load better than expected, and the fuel mixture appears optimal for this power output." On track, Luke was gradually increasing his pace as he learned the Mustang's handling characteristics. Grace could see him experimenting with different racing lines and braking points, the kind of systematic approach that separated serious drivers from weekend enthusiasts. "Your brother's got good instincts," Walt commented. "He's not forcing the car beyond its comfort zone." Grace nodded, but her attention was increasingly focused on Derek Shaw's Corvette, which was now circulating at speeds that seemed almost reckless for a practice session. Through her binoculars, she could see Derek pushing hard through corners. That Luke was still approaching conservatively. "He's trying to intimidate us," Grace realized. "Derek wants everyone to see how fast his car is compared to ours." "Let him," Walt replied calmly. "Practice session times don't mean anything, except to people who don't understand racing. What matters is performance, when it counts." The session continued for another hour, with Luke gradually building confidence and speed, while Grace monitored every system and made notes about potential adjustments. By the time the checkered flag ended the practice period, she had pages of data that would inform modifications for the upcoming championship race. "How did it feel?" Grace asked, as Luke climbed out of the Mustang, his face flushed with excitement and exertion. "Like nothing I've ever driven before," Luke replied honestly. "The power delivery is incredible, and the handling is so precise it's almost telepathic. Grace, this car is genuinely fast." Walt checked his stopwatch and consulted the timing sheets. Hosted by track officials, Luke's fastest lap was only 3/10 slower than Derek's best time, he announced with obvious satisfaction. And that's with Luke still learning the car. The number hit Grace like a perfectly timed gear shift. 3/10 of a second represented the difference between competitive performance and domination, but it was a gap that could be closed through fine-tuning and driving experience rather than fundamental engineering changes. "Derek won't be happy about that," Grace observed, watching the Corvette's crew huddled around their timing equipment with expressions of concern rather than celebration. "No, he won't," Walt agreed, which means the real pressure is just beginning. The drive home from the track gave Grace time to process the morning's events and plan the modifications that would optimize her Mustang's performance for race conditions. The telemetry data revealed several areas where small adjustments could yield significant improvements, the kind of detail-oriented problem-solving that had always energized her more than any academic challenge. 3/10, Luke said, still amazed by how close their home-built car had come to matching Derek's expensive Corvette. "I can find 3/10 just by learning the track better. And I can find 3/10 through aerodynamic improvements. And suspension adjustments," Grace added. "Combined, we might actually be faster than Derek on race day." The possibility sent excitement through both siblings, but Grace's engineering mind was already calculating the challenges that remained. 2 weeks until the championship meant 2 weeks to implement improvements, conduct additional testing, and prepare for whatever obstacles Derek's influential father might create. At Turner Auto Repair, they found Ray working on a customer's transmission. with the careful precision that had made him Blue Ridge's most trusted mechanic before the accident. His movements were more deliberate now, accommodating the nerve damage that had forced him to modify his approach to complex repairs, but his diagnostic abilities remained sharper than those of mechanics half his age. "How did she run?" Ray asked, immediately focusing on the Mustang's mechanical performance rather than lap times or competitive standings. Grace launched into a detailed technical report describing engine behavior, suspension characteristics, and the dozens of small observations that would inform her optimization efforts. Ray listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that racing success depended more on systematic preparation than dramatic gestures. "The rear suspension needs adjustment," Grace concluded. "I'm getting slight oversteer in high speed. Corners, which suggests the anti-roll bar is too stiff." "Easy fix," Ray nodded. "What about the engine?" "Perfect," Grace replied with obvious pride. Oil pressure stayed rock steady, temperatures were optimal, and the power delivery is exactly what I calculated. The afternoon was spent implementing the lessons learned from morning practice, with Grace making precise adjustments to suspension settings while Ray assisted with the kind of subtle modifications that separated good cars from great ones. Their work was interrupted by the arrival of Principal Helen Ward, whose presence at Turner Auto Repair suggested news of significant importance. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Principal Ward said, her expression mixing official business with genuine personal interest in Grace's project. "Not at all," Linda replied, emerging from the office with the kind of smile that mothers reserved for unexpected good news. "What brings you by?" "I wanted to deliver this personally," Principal Ward said, producing an official-looking envelope bearing the MIT logo. "It arrived at school this afternoon." Grace accepted the envelope with hands that trembled slightly, understanding that its contents would either confirm or complicate the opportunities that Dr. Mitchell had described the previous week. The weight of the package suggested comprehensive documentation rather than a simple acceptance or rejection letter. "Open it," Luke urged, his own excitement evident despite the grease stains and mechanical work that surrounded them. Grace carefully opened the envelope and extracted a folder containing multiple documents, her eyes scanning quickly through official letterhead and formal language until she found the crucial information. "Full academic scholarship," she read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tuition, room, board, and research funding for 4 years. The garage fell silent except for the distant sound of traffic on Blue Ridge's main street. Grace stared at the documents in her hands, official confirmation that her automotive passion had somehow opened doors to opportunities that transcended anything she'd imagined possible. "There's more," Principal Ward said with a smile. "Stanford, Georgia Tech, and Carnegie Mellon have all submitted similar offers. Grace, you have your choice of the best engineering programs in the country." Ray wiped his hands on a shop rag, his weathered face reflecting a mixture of pride and amazement that his daughter's determination had attracted the attention of institutions he'd only heard about on television. "What do they want in return?" he asked practically, understanding that opportunities of this magnitude usually came with conditions. "Academic excellence and continued innovation," Principal Ward replied. "They're not just recruiting a student. They're investing in someone they believe will contribute to the future of American engineering." Grace set the documents aside and returned to her suspension adjustments, needing the familiar comfort of mechanical work to process the magnitude of what she'd just learned. College scholarships represented security and opportunity, but they also created expectations that would follow her for years to come. "The race is still important," she said, quietly. "These offers prove that my engineering is valuable, but I still need to demonstrate that it works under pressure." The race was always important, Walt said, arriving just in time to overhear the conversation. "But now it's important for the right reasons. You're not trying to prove yourself to Derek Shaw or anyone else in Blue Ridge. You're proving to yourself that you can deliver when the stakes are highest." The remainder of the week passed in a blur of preparation and optimization, with Grace implementing modifications that pushed her Mustang's performance envelope while maintaining the reliability necessary for race conditions. Each adjustment was carefully tested and documented, the kind of systematic approach that had characterized her entire project. Thursday brought another surprise visitor in the form of Tom Morrison, owner of Morrison Machine Shop, and the man whose precision equipment had enabled Grace to fabricate her custom intake manifold. Tom's weathered hands and sharp eyes reflected 40 years of manufacturing experience that had made his shop Blue Ridge's most respected precision facility. "Heard you need some final tweaks," Tom said, examining Grace's latest modifications, with obvious appreciation for the quality of her work. "The intake plenum could use some flow optimization," Grace replied, pointing to areas where careful machining could improve airflow characteristics. "But I can't afford custom work right now." "Who said anything about payment?" Tom smiled. "Consider it an investment in Blue Ridge's reputation. When you win that championship, I want people to know that some of the work was done right here in our town." The offer represented exactly the kind of community support that Grace had never dared to expect. Practical assistance from people who understood the significance of what she was attempting and wanted to contribute to its success. Friday afternoon brought the final practice session before championship weekend, an opportunity to test the latest modifications under race conditions. Grace watched with growing confidence as Luke circulated at speeds that now matched Derek's best times, her systematic improvements combining with his increased experience to produce genuinely competitive performance. "That's it," Walt announced, after checking the final timing sheets. "You're ready?" Grace looked across the pit lane toward Derek's elaborate operation, where paid technicians were implementing modifications that probably cost more than her family's annual income. But for the first time since this competition had begun, she felt genuinely confident that engineering excellence would prove more valuable than unlimited resources. The championship race was 48 hours away, and Grace Turner's homemade Mustang was ready to prove that innovation, determination, and careful preparation could triumph over money, politics, and the kind of prejudice that measured worth by circumstances rather than achievement. Championship morning dawned with the kind of crystal-clear Texas sky that photographers dreamed about and race car drivers prayed for. Grace had been awake since 4, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion that should have come from 3 weeks of intensive preparation. Her final checks of the Mustang systems had been completed the night before, but nervous energy demanded one more inspection of every component that would determine success or failure over the next few hours. The Blue Ridge Speedway parking lot was already filling with spectators and competitors when the Turner family arrived, their modest truck and trailer looking humble beside the elaborate transporters of professional racing teams. Grace had expected some attention given the local interest in her project, but the crowd gathering around their pit area suggested that news of her engineering achievements had spread far beyond Blue Ridge's borders. "Quite a turnout," Ray observed, surveying the mixture of local supporters and automotive enthusiasts who had apparently traveled considerable distances to witness what local media had dubbed the David and Goliath race of the decade. Grace felt the weight of expectations settling on her shoulders like a racing harness, protective but confining, essential but heavy. The past month had transformed her personal project into something approaching a public spectacle, with implications that extended far beyond her own vindication. "There's a reporter from Austin here," Linda said, pointing toward a news van bearing the logo of a regional television station. She wants to interview you before the race. The prospect of media attention made Grace's stomach clench with anxiety, but she understood that her story had transcended local interest to become something that resonated with people who'd never heard of Blue Ridge, Texas. Her wheelchair, her engineering expertise, and her challenge to automotive establishment had apparently created a narrative that appealed to anyone who'd ever been underestimated. Later, Grace said, focusing her attention on the Mustang's final preparation. Right now, I need to make sure everything's perfect. Walt Hayes appeared beside their trailer with the kind of calm confidence that had steadied Grace's nerves throughout this entire journey. His presence represented connection to Blue Ridge's racing heritage and validation that her engineering deserved respect from the community's most knowledgeable enthusiasts. "Big day," Walt said simply, his weathered hands already moving toward the Mustang's hood. "Mind if I take one last look?" Grace nodded gratefully, understanding that Walt's inspection represented both mechanical verification and emotional support. His trained eye quickly catalogued the engine bay's carefully organized components, checking fluid levels and connection integrity with the systematic precision of someone whose expertise had been earned through decades of practical experience. "Beautiful work," Walt murmured, his voice carrying the kind of professional respect that money couldn't buy. "This engine's ready for anything." Across the pit lane, Derek Shaw's operation was conducting its own pre-race preparations with the kind of elaborate choreography that unlimited budgets made possible. Grace counted at least 6 crew members working on his Corvette, each apparently specialized in specific systems and equipped with tools that probably cost more than most people's cars. "Impressive setup," Luke observed, emerging from the Mustang's cockpit after completing his pre-race systems check. "Expensive setup," Grace corrected. "There's a difference." Derek himself stood beside his car wearing a custom racing suit that probably cost more than Grace's entire safety equipment budget, his confident posture suggesting someone who'd never encountered a problem that money couldn't solve. But Grace noticed tension in his crew's movements that suggested not everything was proceeding according to plan. "Trouble in paradise," Walt observed, following Grace's gaze toward Derek's pit area, where heated discussions were taking place between a driver and crew chief. "What kind of trouble?" Grace asked, her engineering curiosity overriding competitive considerations. "Hard to say from here," Walt replied, "but that body language suggests mechanical problems rather than setup disagreements." The track announcer's voice echoed across the facility, calling drivers to the mandatory pre-race meeting where safety procedures and competition rules would be reviewed. Grace watched Luke join the group of competitors, noting how her brother's modest appearance contrasted with the professional racing suits and corporate sponsorship logos displayed by most other drivers. 32 entries, the race director announced, reading from his clipboard with the authority of someone who'd managed hundreds of similar events. "This is the largest field in Blue Ridge Championship history." Grace felt pride mixed with pressure as she realized that her story had apparently attracted competitors from across the region, transforming a local event into something approaching professional significance. The increased field size meant more competition, but also more witnesses to whatever happened over the next few hours. "Technical inspection begins in 15 minutes, the race director continued. "All vehicles must pass safety and performance checks before being cleared for competition." Grace's stomach tightened at the mention of technical inspection, remembering Walt's warnings about Richard Shaw's influence with racing officials. Her Mustang met every safety requirement and exceeded most performance standards. But politics, it could create problems that engineering excellence couldn't solve. "You ready for this?" Luke asked, returning from the driver's meeting with an expression that mixed excitement with determination. "The car's ready," Grace replied. "Whether I'm ready is a different question." The technical inspection process proceeded with bureaucratic efficiency that revealed both the thoroughness of modern safety standards and the political undercurrents that Walt had warned about. Grace watched nervously as officials examined every component of her Mustang, their clipboards filled with specifications that could disqualify her for violations both legitimate and manufactured. Roll cage construction meets all requirements, the lead inspector announced after 20 minutes of detailed examination. Safety equipment exceeds minimum standards. Grace felt relief wash over her like cool air from a perfectly tuned air conditioning system. The donated safety equipment had been installed with meticulous attention to detail, but official validation eliminated one potential source of complications. Engine displacement and modifications are within class regulations. The inspector continued, completing his examination of Grace's carefully documented engine specifications. Any problems? Richard Shaw's voice cut through the inspection area like an aggressive exhaust note, his presence immediately changing the atmosphere from routine procedure to political tension. Grace recognized Derek's father from newspaper, photos that usually accompanied stories about successful local businesses, but seeing him in person revealed the kind of commanding presence that came from years of getting his way through a combination of money and influence. "No problems, Mr. Shaw," the inspector replied carefully. "This vehicle meets all technical requirements." "I find that hard to believe," Richard Shaw said, his tone carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his opinions treated as facts. "Surely a car built from salvaged parts can't meet the same standards as professionally constructed vehicles." Grace felt anger flare in her chest, but Walt's restraining hand on her shoulder reminded her that losing her temper would only provide ammunition for people looking for reasons to disqualify her. "The construction quality is actually exceptional," the inspector said, apparently willing to stand by his professional assessment despite political pressure. "The workmanship and attention to detail exceed many factory-built race cars." Richard Shaw's expression darkened as his attempt at intimidation failed to produce the desired result. "We'll see how exceptional it looks when it falls apart on the track." "Dad," Derek appeared beside his father with obvious embarrassment, his racing suit bearing fresh stains that suggested ongoing mechanical problems. "Maybe we should focus on our own car." Grace noticed the exchange with interest, recognizing the kind of family tension that she'd never experienced with her own supportive parents. Derek's discomfort with his father's aggressive behavior suggested complexity that she hadn't previously considered. "Your car passed inspection," the official announced to Grace, handing her a sticker that would allow the Mustang to compete. "Good luck out there." The next hour passed in final preparations that combined mechanical necessity with nervous energy management. Grace conducted one last systems check, while Luke prepared mentally for the kind of high-stress competition that would test both driving skill and the Mustang's engineering integrity. "Remember," Grace told her brother as he prepared to climb into the cockpit, "the car's faster than Derek's in the corners. Use that advantage and don't try to match his straight-line speed." "Got it," Luke replied, but his expression suggested the kind of pre-race nervousness that even the most experienced drivers never completely overcame. The crowd had grown throughout the morning, with spectators filling grandstands that usually accommodated much smaller audiences. Grace could see local news crews positioning cameras and interviewing people who'd apparently made special trips to witness what had become known throughout Texas racing circles as the Blue Ridge Miracle Race. "Ladies and gentlemen," the track announcer's voice boomed across the facility, "drivers, start your engines." The sound that followed was like automotive thunder, 32 race cars firing to life simultaneously and creating a symphony of mechanical power that made Grace's spine tingle with excitement. Her Mustang's distinctive exhaust note was audible even among the competition, the custom headers and exhaust system producing exactly the aggressive sound signature she'd engineered. "Formation lap," the announcer continued, and Grace watched with breathless attention as Luke guided her Mustang onto the racing surface for the first time under full competitive conditions. The formation lap allowed drivers to warm their tires and check their car's handling characteristics, while officials verified that all systems were functioning properly. Grace monitored her simple telemetry display, watching engine temperatures and pressures that would reveal any problems before they became catastrophic. "Everything looks good," Walt observed, reading the data over Grace's shoulder. "Oil pressures steady, coolant temperatures optimal, and the engines running smoothly." Grace nodded, but her attention was focused on Derek's Corvette, which appeared to be trailing white smoke that suggested cooling system problems. The elaborate pre-race preparation and expensive equipment apparently hadn't prevented mechanical difficulties that could affect competitive performance. "Derek's got issues," Grace observed, pointing toward the smoke trail that was becoming increasingly visible. "Racing's funny that way," Walt replied. "Sometimes the simplest approach works better than the most expensive one." The pace car pulled off the racing surface as the field completed its formation lap, leaving 32 drivers alone with their machines and the kind of competitive pressure that separated genuine racers from weekend enthusiasts. Grace felt her heart rate increase as she watched Luke position the Mustang in the middle of the field, exactly where his qualifying time had placed him. "Green flag racing," the announcer called, his voice barely audible above the roar of engines accelerating toward the first turn. Grace gripped her wheelchair's armrests as Luke dove into the first corner, her Mustang immediately demonstrating the handling characteristics that months of careful engineering had created. The car rotated through turns with precision that made several more expensive vehicles look clumsy by comparison, validating calculations that had existed only on paper until this moment. "He's moving up," Walt said with obvious excitement, watching Luke navigate through traffic with the kind of smooth aggression that separated fast drivers from merely brave ones. By the end of the first lap, Luke had gained 3 positions and was running directly behind Derek's Corvette, which continued trailing suspicious amounts of white smoke despite its crew's pre-race confidence. Grace realized that her brother was about to face the ultimate test of both his driving ability and her engineering expertise. The real race was just beginning, and 3 years of determination, innovation, and preparation were about to be evaluated by the most demanding judge of all, the unforgiving reality of high-speed competition, where mechanical excellence and human skill combined to create either triumph or disaster. Grace Turner's homemade Mustang was running exactly as she'd engineered it to run, but the next hour would determine whether her calculations had been sufficient to overcome the advantages that money, politics, and social prejudice had always provided to people like Derek Shaw. The racing surface of Blue Ridge Speedway had become a high-speed chess match where split-second decisions determined the difference between triumph and catastrophe. Grace watched through binoculars as Luke maneuvered her Mustang through traffic, with the kind of calculated aggression that separated genuine racers from merely fast drivers, each corner entry demonstrating the handling characteristics that months of engineering had carefully optimized. "Lap 15, Walt announced, his stopwatch marking time that felt both endless and instantaneous. Luke's running 5th overall and gaining on the leaders. Grace's telemetry display showed engine parameters that validated every calculation she'd made during the past 3 years. Oil pressure remained rock steady, coolant temperature stayed within optimal ranges, and fuel consumption matched her projections with mathematical precision. The Mustang was performing exactly as engineered, but racing success required more. than mechanical perfection. Derek's losing power, Grace observed, watching the Corvette's smoking engine struggle to maintain position as Luke closed the gap with each passing corner. That white smoke is getting worse. The irony wasn't lost on her that Derek's expensive, professionally prepared car was experiencing the kind of mechanical failure that everyone had predicted would plague her salvaged parts Mustang. Money and sophisticated equipment, apparently, couldn't prevent the fundamental engineering problems that careful planning and systematic preparation had avoided. "Lap 20! The track announcer's voice crackled through the pit lane speakers. The Turner Mustang continues its march through the field, now running fourth overall and closing on the leaders. Grace felt a mixture of pride and terror as she realized that Luke was actually contending for victory rather than merely trying to finish respectably. The scholarship offers had removed pressure to prove her engineering was legitimate, but winning the championship would demonstrate something far more significant: that innovation and determination could triumph over the advantages that money typically provided. "There goes Derek," Walt said with obvious satisfaction as Luke pulled alongside the struggling Corvette entering turn 3. Grace held her breath as the two cars raced side by side through the corner, her Mustang's superior handling, allowing Luke to maintain momentum, while Derek's car struggled with whatever mechanical problem was sapping its power. The moment represented 3 years of accumulated frustration and determination, distilled into a few seconds of high-speed competition where engineering excellence would be measured against inherited advantage. Luke completed the pass cleanly, pulling ahead of Derek's Corvette with authority that left no question about which car was genuinely faster. Grace felt tears of joy streaming down her face as she watched Derek fall back through the field, his elaborate preparation and unlimited budget ultimately insufficient to overcome fundamental mechanical problems. "Third place," the announcer called, his voice carrying excitement that suggested even professional racing commentators weren't immune to underdog stories. "The Turner Mustang has moved into third place and is closing on the leaders." Grace's attention shifted to the two cars ahead of Luke, professional racing machines with factory support and experienced drivers who'd been competing at this level for years. Her Mustang had proven capable of beating Derek Shaw, but overtaking genuine professional competition would require everything her engineering could deliver. "Lap 30, Walt announced. 20 laps to go, and Luke's less than 2 seconds behind. The leaders. The gap was close enough to be exciting, but far enough to be challenging, requiring sustained performance that would test both Luke's driving ability and the Mustang's mechanical reliability. Grace monitored her telemetry obsessively, watching for any sign of the component failures that could transform victory into heartbreak in the space of a single corner. "Engine temperatures rising slightly," Grace observed, noting a trend that was still within acceptable parameters but worth monitoring. "The cooling system's working harder than expected. Track temperatures climbed since this morning," Walt replied. "That's affecting everyone, not just us." Grace nodded but continued watching the data, understanding that margin for error decreased. As mechanical stress increased, her cooling system had been designed with adequate capacity for racing conditions, but engineering always involved compromises between performance and reliability. "He's catching them," Ray said with excitement, pointing toward the track where Luke was visibly closing the gap between his Mustang and the two leaders. "Whatever you did to that car, Grace, it's working." The compliment from her father carried weight that no scholarship offer could match, validation from the man whose mechanical expertise had inspired her own automotive passion. But Grace remained focused on the challenge ahead, understanding that mechanical advantage meant nothing without the driving skill to exploit it effectively. "Lap 35, the announcer called. "The Turner Mustang has closed to within 1 second of the leaders and appears to have superior corner speed." Grace could see the truth of that observation through her binoculars, watching Luke carry more speed through the technical sections where her suspension modifications provided genuine competitive advantage. The Mustang rotated through corners with precision that made the leading cars look heavy and cumbersome by comparison. "There's the move," Walt said suddenly, his voice tight with excitement. Grace watched Luke dive to the inside of turn 6, using superior braking performance and cornering speed to pull alongside the second-place car. The pass was completed with authority that demonstrated both driving skill and mechanical superiority, leaving Grace barely able to breathe as she realized her brother was now running second overall. "One to go," Walt announced, his stopwatch marking progress toward a conclusion that had seemed impossible when this journey began 3 years ago. The leading car was a professionally prepared Camaro, with factory support and a driver whose resume included victories at tracks throughout the Southwest. Passing Derek Shaw had been personally satisfying, but overtaking genuine professional competition would prove that Grace's engineering deserved recognition on merit rather than sentiment. "Lap 40, the announcer called, his voice carrying the kind of excitement that suggested even experienced commentators recognized they were witnessing something special. 10 laps remaining, and the Turner Mustang is closing on the leader. Grace felt her heart pounding as Luke began pressuring the leading Camaro, searching for opportunities to complete a pass that would transform her personal vindication into something approaching automotive legend. The crowd noise was audible, even from pit lane, spectators apparently as invested in the outcome as Grace herself. "He's got superior corner speed," Grace observed, watching Luke pull alongside the Camaro through the sweeping turns where her aerodynamic modifications provided measurable advantage. But the Camaro's faster on the straightaways. The tactical challenge was complex. Luke needed to use cornering superiority to create passing opportunities while avoiding situations where the Camaro's superior straight-line speed would allow it to retake position. Grace realized that victory would require not just engineering excellence, but strategic thinking under pressure. "Lap 42, Walt announced. 8 laps to go." Luke made his move, entering the track's most challenging section, diving to the inside of turn 12 and using superior braking performance to pull alongside the leading Camaro. Grace held her breath as the two cars raced wheel to wheel through a series of corners that would determine whether 3 years of determination had been sufficient to achieve the impossible. "He's clear," Ray shouted, his voice carrying joy that echoed across their entire pit area. Grace felt momentary elation as Luke pulled ahead, but her engineering mind immediately shifted to the challenge of maintaining position for the remaining 7 laps. Leading a race created different pressures than chasing, requiring sustained performance under circumstances where any mechanical problem would be catastrophic. "Coolant temperatures climbing," Grace observed, noting readings that were approaching the upper limit of acceptable ranges. "We need to manage thermal load carefully." "Can the engine handle it?" Walt asked, his celebration tempered by practical concerns. "It should," Grace replied, though her voice carried uncertainty that reflected the fundamental reality of racing. Engineering calculations could minimize risk, but never eliminate it entirely. "Lap 45, the announcer called. 5 laps remaining, and the Turner Mustang leads by 3 seconds. The gap was significant but not comfortable, requiring Luke to maintain pace while managing equipment that was being pushed to its design limits. Grace watched her telemetry obsessively, monitoring every parameter that could indicate impending mechanical failure. "Oil pressures dropping slightly," Grace noted, observing a trend that was still within normal ranges but worth attention. "Engine's working hard," Walt replied, "but it's holding together." Grace nodded, but she could feel tension building in her shoulders as mechanical stress accumulated with each passing lap. Her engineering had been conservative where safety was concerned, but racing always pushed components beyond their intended design parameters. Lap 47, Walt announced. 3 laps to go. The Camaro was closing slightly, its professional crew apparently finding speed that had been held in reserve for exactly this situation. Grace realized that the final 3 laps would test everything her engineering could deliver, requiring sustained performance under maximum stress. "He's got this," Ray said with confidence that Grace desperately wanted to share. "Lap 48, the announcer called, his voice betraying excitement that professional commentators usually tried to suppress. 2 laps remaining, and the Turner Mustang maintains its lead. Grace felt her hands shaking as she monitored telemetry that showed her engine operating at the absolute limit of its design envelope. Every component was working harder than intended, but the systematic approach that had characterized her entire project was keeping mechanical failure at bay. 1 lap to go, Walt announced, his voice barely audible above crowd noise that had reached deafening levels. Grace watched through binoculars as Luke guided her Mustang into the final lap, her engineering about to face its ultimate test. 3 years of calculation, fabrication, and preparation had led to this moment where theory would be validated or destroyed by the unforgiving reality of high-speed competition. "Final turn," the announcer called, his professional composure finally breaking under the weight of witnessing automotive history. Grace held her breath as Luke negotiated the last corner and accelerated toward the finish line. A homemade Mustang carrying 3 years of dreams toward a conclusion that would either vindicate everything she'd believed about the relationship between engineering excellence and competitive success. The checkered flag fell with authority. That ended not just a race, but a chapter of Grace Turner's life that had begun with tragedy and was concluding with triumph that transcended anything she dared to imagine possible. Luke Turner had won the Blue Ridge Championship driving a car engineered by his 17-year-old sister, proving that innovation and determination could overcome advantages that money and social position had always provided to people like Derek Shaw. Grace Turner's impossible dream had become undeniable reality. The silence that followed the checkered flag lasted only a heartbeat before the Blue Ridge Speedway erupted into the kind of celebration that small towns reserved for moments when the impossible became undeniably real. Grace sat motionless in her wheelchair, staring at the timing board that confirmed what her eyes had witnessed, but her mind struggled to process. Luke Turner, driving a car engineered by his sister from salvaged parts, had won the Blue Ridge Championship by 6 seconds over professional competition. "We did it," Walt Hayes said quietly, his weathered voice carrying emotion that 50 years of racing experience couldn't entirely suppress. "Grace, we actually did it." The words penetrated Grace's shock like oil through an engine, finally triggering. The tears that had been building for 3 years of determination, frustration, and dreams that others had dismissed as impossible. Her Mustang had not only finished the race, but dominated it, proving that engineering excellence could triumph over the advantages that money and social position typically provided. "The engine," Grace managed to say through her tears, her mind automatically shifting to mechanical concerns even in the midst of emotional overwhelm. "How are the temperatures?" Walt checked the telemetry display and smiled. "Everything's perfect. Oil pressure's steady, coolant temperatures dropping back to normal ranges, and there's no sign of mechanical stress." Grace felt a surge of professional pride that equaled her personal satisfaction. The conservative engineering approach that others had mocked as insufficient had proven robust enough to deliver victory under the most demanding circumstances possible. Across the track, Luke had climbed out of the Mustang and was being swarmed by reporters, photographers, and spectators who wanted to touch the car that had rewritten Blue Ridge's understanding of what innovation could accomplish. Even from pit lane, Grace could see her brother's face glowing with the kind of joy that came from achieving something genuinely meaningful. Grace Turner! A reporter's voice cut through the celebration as a news crew approached their pit area. How does it feel to have engineered the winning car? The question hung in the air like exhaust fumes, carrying implications that Grace was still processing. 3 hours ago, she'd been a high school student with engineering ambitions and college scholarship offers. Now, she was the designer of a championship-winning race car that had beaten professional competition through pure technical superiority. It feels like validation, Grace replied honestly, her voice steadying as she focused on the engineering achievement rather than the emotional overwhelm. This car performed exactly as calculated, which proves that systematic engineering can overcome resource limitations. What do you say to people who claimed your car wouldn't last 5 laps? Another reporter asked. Grace paused, considering her response carefully. The temptation to express satisfaction at proving Derek Shaw wrong was strong, but her engineering training had taught her that results spoke louder than rhetoric. The performance data speaks for itself, Grace said diplomatically. Good engineering doesn't depend on budget size or social position. It depends on understanding mechanical principles and applying them systematically. The crowd around their pit area continued growing as word spread through the racing community that the Blue Ridge Championship had been won by a teenager girl's homemade car. Grace found herself answering technical questions from professional mechanics who wanted to understand how salvaged components had been transformed into championship-winning performance. The key was weight distribution, Grace explained to a group of engineers from a factory racing team. I calculated optimal center of gravity and modified the suspension geometry to achieve neutral handling characteristics. What about the engine modifications? Asked a mechanic whose experience with professional racing equipment was evident in his detailed questions. Grace launched into a technical discussion of compression ratios, intake manifold design, and exhaust flow dynamics, her confidence growing, as she realized that professional mechanics were treating her explanations with genuine respect rather than condescending tolerance. Impressive work, the factory team engineer concluded. Your approach to systems integration is more sophisticated than most professional builds I've seen. The compliment carried weight that no amount of social validation could match. Recognition from peers who understood the complexity of what she'd accomplished and could evaluate her work on its technical merits. Principal Helen Ward appeared through the crowd with a smile that suggested she was enjoying her association with Blue Ridge High School's most famous student. Behind her walked Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the federal education official whose scholarship offers had already transformed Grace's future possibilities. Congratulations, Dr. Mitchell said, extending her hand with obvious satisfaction. Though I have to admit, we knew you were exceptional before today's race confirmed it. Thank you, Grace replied, still processing the reality that her automotive passion had attracted attention from institutions she'd only dreamed of attending. I wanted to let you know, Dr. Mitchell continued, that all 4 universities have confirmed their scholarship offers regardless of today's outcome. Your engineering ability was never dependent on winning this race. The news brought relief that Grace hadn't realized she needed. The scholarships represented opportunities that transcended local validation, opening doors to educational experiences that would have been impossible without recognition of her technical abilities. However, Dr. Mitchell added with a smile, winning the championship certainly doesn't hurt your applications. Luke finally made his way through the crowd to reach his family, his racing suit soaked with champagne and his face glowing with accomplishment that extended far beyond personal achievement. Grace could see in his expression the same satisfaction she felt. They had proven something important about the relationship between determination and possibility. "How does it feel to be a championship-winning driver?" Grace asked her brother. "Like, I was just along for the ride," Luke replied honestly. "That car is absolutely incredible, Grace. Every system worked perfectly, and the handling was so precise it felt like driving a computer simulation." The compliment meant more to Grace than any external recognition, because it came from someone who'd experienced her engineering firsthand under the most demanding circumstances possible. Luke's success validated not just her calculations, but her understanding of what racing performance actually required. "Where's Derek?" Grace asked, suddenly realizing that her former tormentor hadn't appeared among the congratulatory crowd. "His car's still smoking in the pits," Walt replied with a mixture of satisfaction and sympathy. "Blown head gasket looks like. Expensive lesson about the difference between complex and effective." Grace felt a moment of sympathy for Derek despite their history of conflict. Mechanical failure was disappointing regardless of its cause, and she understood the frustration of watching engineering work undermined by component problems. "I should probably go check on him," Grace said, surprising herself with the impulse toward sportsmanship. "That's generous of you," Ray observed, pride evident in his voice as he recognized his daughter's maturity. Grace maneuvered her wheelchair through the crowd toward Derek's pit area, where she found him standing beside his disabled Corvette with the kind of dejected expression that accompanied the gap between expectation and reality. His expensive racing suit and elaborate equipment looked somehow diminished in the aftermath of mechanical failure. "I'm sorry about your engine," Grace said quietly, approaching with genuine sympathy rather than triumphant satisfaction. Derek looked up with surprise that gradually shifted to something approaching respect. "Your car ran perfectly," he admitted reluctantly. "I watched the telemetry, no mechanical problems at all." "Conservative engineering," Grace replied. "I designed everything with significant safety margins because reliability was more important than peak performance." "My crew chief said the same thing," Derek said, his tone carrying newfound understanding of concepts he'd previously dismissed. "He said your approach was more professional than what we were doing." The admission represented a fundamental shift in Derek's understanding of what engineering actually meant, recognition that sophistication didn't always correlate with complexity or cost. "Want to see how the cooling system works?" Grace offered, genuinely interested in sharing technical knowledge despite their personal history. Derek nodded, following Grace back to her Mustang, where she explained the thermal management principles that had prevented the overheating problems that had plagued his Corvette. The conversation was purely technical, focused on mechanical systems rather than personal conflict, and Grace found herself enjoying the opportunity to discuss engineering with someone who was finally listening seriously. "I never understood what you were actually doing," Derek admitted, as Grace finished explaining her approach to heat exchanger design. "I thought you were just playing with car parts." "I was solving engineering problems," Grace corrected gently. "The same problems that professional teams face, just with different resource constraints." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Brittany Wells, whose expression carried a mixture of embarrassment and something that might have been genuine remorse. Grace hadn't seen her former tormentor since the race began, but Brittany's presence suggested that championship victory had complicated social dynamics that had once seemed fixed. "Grace," Brittany said hesitantly, "I wanted to congratulate you. What you accomplished today was amazing." The apology was awkward, but apparently sincere, delivered by someone who was clearly struggling with the gap between her previous assumptions and current reality. Grace realized that her success had forced everyone at Blue Ridge High School to reconsider their understanding of what she was capable of achieving. "Thank you," Grace replied simply, understanding that genuine change took time, and that victory. Speeches were less important than continued excellence. The remainder of the afternoon passed in a blur of interviews, photographs, and technical discussions with racing professionals who wanted to understand how a 17-year-old girl had engineered a car that outperformed vehicles with 10 times her budget. Grace found herself energized by the technical conversations, finally able to discuss her engineering with people who understood its complexity and significance. "What's next?" asked a reporter from a national automotive magazine who was apparently planning a feature story about Grace's achievement. Grace paused, considering the question that addressed not just immediate plans, but the trajectory of a life that had been fundamentally altered by 3 years of determination and one afternoon of validation. "College," Grace said simply. "I want to study mechanical engineering and learn everything I can about automotive design. There are so many problems to solve and improvements to make." "Any interest in professional racing?" the reporter pressed. "Maybe someday," Grace replied honestly. "But right now I'm more interested in the engineering side. Racing is one application of mechanical principles, but there are so many others." As the sun began setting over Blue Ridge Speedway, the Turner family gathered around their championship-winning Mustang for photographs that would commemorate not just a racing victory, but a moment when determination had triumphed over circumstances that others had viewed as insurmountable limitations. Grace placed her hand on the car's fender and felt the solid reality of 3 years' worth of dreams made manifest in steel and aluminum. The Mustang had proven that innovation could overcome prejudice, that systematic engineering could triumph over unlimited budgets, and that the only limitations that truly mattered were the ones people chose to accept. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities that extended far beyond Blue Ridge, Texas. College applications needed completion, scholarship paperwork required signatures, and her engineering education was about to begin in earnest. But tonight, surrounded by family and friends who had supported her impossible dream, Grace Turner felt the deep satisfaction that came from proving that excellence was determined by effort rather than circumstances. The girl who'd been dismissed as broken 3 years ago had engineered her way to championship victory, rewriting everyone's understanding of what was possible when determination met opportunity and innovation conquered prejudice. 6 months after the Blue Ridge Championship, Grace Turner sat in the engineering workshop at MIT, surrounded by the kind of sophisticated equipment that she'd only dreamed about during those late nights in her family's garage. The computer-controlled milling machine hummed quietly as it shaped aluminum components for her senior design project. An innovative hybrid powertrain that combined lessons learned from her Mustang experience with cutting-edge electric motor technology. "Your approach to thermal management is fascinating," Dr. Jennifer Walsh said, examining Grace's latest calculations with the kind of respect that had characterized every interaction since her arrival at the university. "The principles you developed for racing applications have direct relevance to production vehicle design." Grace smiled, understanding that her unconventional path to engineering education had provided perspectives that traditional students often lacked. The 3 years spent building a championship-winning car from salvaged parts had taught her to see solutions where others saw limitations, a mindset that translated perfectly to academic research challenges. "I learned that complex problems usually have simple solutions if you understand the underlying principles," Grace replied, adjusting her wheelchair to get a better view of the components taking shape on the machine. "My Mustang taught me more about practical engineering than any textbook could." The workshop door opened to admit Professor Michael Chen, MIT's director of automotive research and Grace's faculty advisor, whose own background included stints at Formula One teams and major automotive manufacturers. His initial skepticism about accepting a student who'd learned engineering in her family's garage had been replaced by genuine amazement at Grace's intuitive understanding of mechanical systems. The hybrid prototype is ready for dynamometer testing, Professor Chen announced, referring to Grace's semester project that had attracted attention from several major automotive manufacturers. Are you prepared to see whether your calculations match reality? Grace felt the familiar mixture of excitement and nervousness that had preceded every significant test since her first track session at Blue Ridge Speedway. Engineering confidence came from systematic preparation, but real-world validation always carried the possibility that theory might be insufficient to address practical challenges. Let's find out, Grace said, wheeling toward the dynamometer bay where her hybrid powertrain waited to prove whether 6 months of graduate-level engineering work had been sufficient to create something genuinely innovative. The test facility represented the kind of sophisticated instrumentation that would have been impossible to imagine during her high school years. Capable of measuring performance parameters with precision that made her old telemetry system look primitive by comparison. But the fundamental principles remained the same. Engineering excellence was measured by results rather than intentions. Initial startup sequence looks good, the technician announced as Grace's hybrid system came online with the smooth efficiency that months of careful development had achieved. All parameters are within expected ranges. Grace monitored the data streaming across multiple displays, her trained eye cataloging performance characteristics that would determine whether her innovation represented genuine advancement or merely academic exercise. The numbers looked promising, but real validation would come from sustained operation under variable load conditions. Power output is exceeding your projections, Professor Chen observed with obvious satisfaction. Fuel efficiency is also better than predicted. The compliments felt familiar, reminiscent of Walt Hayes' approval when her Mustang had first demonstrated competitive performance. But Grace had learned that individual achievements mattered less than their contribution to broader understanding, and her hybrid research was designed to address challenges that extended far beyond personal validation. This technology could revolutionize urban transportation, Dr. Walsh commented, studying the efficiency curves that Grace's system was generating. The combination of performance and environmental responsibility is exactly what the industry needs. Grace nodded, but her attention was focused on the next phase of testing that would reveal whether her engineering could maintain performance under the kind of stress that real-world applications would demand. Academic success meant nothing if the solutions couldn't survive practical implementation. The morning's testing concluded with results that exceeded every projection Grace had made. Validation that her unconventional background had provided insights that traditional engineering education might have missed. But more importantly, the data suggested that her research could contribute to automotive technologies that would benefit millions of people rather than just proving individual capability. Exceptional work, Professor Chen said as they reviewed the final test results. I've already had inquiries from Toyota, Ford, and Tesla about licensing your thermal management innovations. The news represented opportunities that Grace had never imagined during those early days when college itself had seemed impossible. Major automotive manufacturers were interested in her engineering not because of her inspirational story, but because her solutions addressed real problems more effectively than existing approaches. What do they want? Grace asked, her mind already calculating the implications of commercial interest in her academic research. Manufacturing licenses for the hybrid cooling system, Professor Chen replied. Your approach to heat exchanger optimization could improve efficiency across their entire product lines. Grace felt the same satisfaction that had followed her Mustang's championship victory, recognition that engineering excellence could transcend personal circumstances to create value for broader communities. But she also understood that commercial success brought responsibilities that extended beyond technical achievement. "I want to make sure the technology remains accessible," Grace said carefully, "especially for smaller manufacturers who can't afford expensive licensing fees." Professor Chen smiled, recognizing the same principled approach that had characterized Grace's entire engineering philosophy. "We can structure agreements that balance commercial viability with broader accessibility. Your technology could benefit everyone, not just major corporations." The afternoon brought a surprise visitor in the form of Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the federal education official whose scholarship offers had made Grace's MIT education possible. Dr. Mitchell's presence suggested that Grace's academic success had continued attracting attention from government agencies interested in supporting innovative research. "They wanted to see how our investment is paying off," Dr. Mitchell said, with obvious satisfaction as she toured Grace's workshop and examined the hybrid prototype that represented months of intensive development work. "Better than I expected when I started," Grace replied honestly. "The resources here have allowed me to explore ideas that would have been impossible in my family's garage. Though I suspect your garage experience provided perspectives that formal education couldn't duplicate," Dr. Mitchell observed. "Your approach to problem solving is remarkably practical for someone with such advanced theoretical knowledge." Grace understood the compliment's deeper meaning. Her unconventional path to engineering had created a unique combination of hands-on experience and academic rigor that traditional students often lacked, enabling innovations that bridge the gap between laboratory research and real-world applications. "What's next for you?" Dr. Mitchell asked, her question carrying implications that extended beyond immediate academic plans. Grace paused, considering possibilities that ranged from graduate school to startup companies to positions with major automotive manufacturers. The championship victory had opened doors that led to MIT, but her research success was creating opportunities that could shape the next phase of her career. "I want to continue developing technologies that make automotive innovation more accessible," Grace said thoughtfully. "Too many good ideas never reach practical application because they require resources that most people can't afford." "Democratizing innovation," Dr. Mitchell nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that American engineering needs to maintain its competitive edge." The conversation was interrupted by Grace's phone, which displayed a call from Luke with the urgency indicator that suggested important news from home. Grace answered quickly, immediately detecting excitement in her brother's voice that reminded her of championship morning 6 months earlier. "Grace, you need to see the news," Luke said without preamble. "There's a story about you in Automotive Engineering magazine, and it's getting national attention." Grace felt a familiar mixture of pride and apprehension as she realized that her academic work was attracting the kind of media coverage that could transform her from successful student to public figure. Recognition was gratifying, but public attention carried responsibilities that she wasn't certain she was prepared to handle. "What kind of story?" Grace asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer would complicate her previously quiet academic existence. "Feature article about your research, but they're also talking about the Mustang and everything that led to MIT," Luke explained. "The reporter called you the engineer who's revolutionizing how America thinks about innovation." The description was flattering but overwhelming, suggesting expectations that extended far beyond technical achievement to encompass broader social change. Grace had always focused on solving engineering problems rather than becoming a symbol, But public recognition apparently came with implications that she couldn't control. "Are you okay with this level of attention?" Dr. Mitchell asked, recognizing Grace's discomfort with the prospect of increased public scrutiny. "I just want to do good engineering work," Grace replied honestly. "But if that work can inspire other people to pursue their own goals, then I guess the attention serves a purpose." The remainder of the afternoon was spent reviewing Grace's research, timeline, and discussing publication strategies that would maximize the impact of her innovations while protecting her ability to continue developing new technologies. The balance between public recognition and academic freedom was delicate, requiring careful navigation to avoid compromising future opportunities. Evening brought a video call with her family, gathered around the kitchen table in Blue Ridge, where Grace's journey had begun 3 years earlier. Turner Auto Repair continued operating successfully, its reputation enhanced by association with their famous daughter, but the fundamental character of their small-town life remained unchanged. "How's the car running?" Grace asked, referring to her championship-winning Mustang, which had been retired from competition and now served as a display vehicle at local automotive events. "Perfect," Ray replied with obvious pride. "We get visitors almost every weekend wanting to see the car that beat Derek Shaw. Some of them are engineers from major companies who want to understand your modifications." Grace smiled, understanding that her Mustang had become something approaching automotive folklore, a symbol of what innovation could achieve when determination met opportunity. The car represented more than personal achievement. It demonstrated principles that could inspire other people to pursue their own impossible dreams. "Derek stopped by last week," Linda added, her tone suggesting news that would interest Grace, despite their complicated history. "Oh?" Grace replied, curious about her former antagonist, whose understanding of engineering had evolved considerably since their championship confrontation. "He's starting engineering school next fall," Linda continued. "Says he wants to learn how to build cars properly instead of just buying expensive ones." The news brought Grace genuine satisfaction, understanding that Derek's conversion from arrogant competitor to serious student represented exactly the kind of change that made her success, meaningful beyond personal validation. Competition had taught him lessons that wealth couldn't provide, motivating real growth rather than mere defeat. "That's wonderful," Grace said sincerely. "Engineering needs people who understand the difference between complex and effective." The call concluded with family updates and encouragement that reinforced Grace's connection to the values and relationships that had sustained her through every challenge. Success at MIT was gratifying, but support from Blue Ridge remained the foundation that made everything else possible. Later that evening, Grace sat in her dormitory room reviewing research notes and contemplating the trajectory that had led from a devastating car accident to championship victory to cutting-edge engineering research that could benefit millions of people. The path had been neither straight nor predictable, but each challenge had provided lessons that contributed to current capabilities. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Stone Reed, her former classmate, whose quiet support had meant more than he probably realized during those difficult high school years. Stone was now studying computer science at the University of Texas, applying the same analytical thinking that had attracted him to Grace's engineering approach. "Saw the magazine article," Stone's message read. "Not surprised you're changing the world. Always knew you were the smartest person in Blue Ridge." Grace smiled, remembering the shy boy who'd been her lab partner and understanding that his friendship had provided exactly the kind of validation she'd needed during her most difficult period. Success was personally satisfying, but relationships remained the source of meaning that made achievement worthwhile. Outside her dormitory window, Boston stretched toward horizons that contained possibilities Grace was still discovering. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities that built on everything she'd learned during the journey from tragedy to triumph. But tonight, she felt the deep satisfaction that came from understanding her own capabilities and potential. 3 years ago, Grace Turner had been a broken girl in a wheelchair, dismissed by classmates who saw only limitations rather than possibilities. Tonight, she was an MIT engineering student whose research could revolutionize automotive technology and whose story demonstrated that excellence was determined by effort rather than circumstances. The future stretched ahead like an open highway, filled with challenges that would test everything she'd learned and opportunities to prove that innovation, determination, and careful engineering could overcome any obstacle that prejudice or circumstance could create. Grace Turner was ready for whatever came next, confident that her wheels would carry her toward destinations that others might consider impossible, but that she understood to be merely engineering problems waiting for systematic solutions. The girl who'd been told she was broken had instead broken every expectation that others had tried to impose, proving that the only limitations that truly mattered were the ones people chose to accept. Grace Turner's story was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click to watch. And don't forget to subscribe. It would mean a lot.